Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ideas xLab's Uncovering Connection and Inclusion video podcast. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ideas xLab, Josh Miller, and I'm really looking forward to my discussion today with Shaun Chavis. I had the pleasure of meeting Shaun here in Louisville. Although she is based in Atlanta, I've gotten to taste her cooking. We've gotten to go on some explorations together in New Orleans, and I've gotten to watch as she has developed the company that she is now the CEO of LVNGbook. So I think this is going to be a really informative discussion. It really ties into all of the things that this podcast series has been thinking about as we look at connection, inclusion, and how are we aligning our vision and values in ever-changing times. So I'm honored to be joined by Shaun. Shaun, I'm going to get you pulled up with me on screen. Welcome to the Uncovering Video podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
I am so looking forward to getting to connect with you and hear and have an opportunity for you to share updates about LVNGbook. But where I want to start is really with you as an individual. One of the questions that I've really found so great in terms of getting to know people on a different level and in a deeper and really meaningful way is the question of what gives you oxygen in your life and work. And that's where I'd love to start today.
Um, Driven to create, and I've also been driven to organize. And so I'm very driven by having an idea or vision and then doing everything I can to meet that goal. When I was a little girl, to give you an example, I used to love to sew, and I would fall asleep on top of the fabric and patterns, staying awake trying to finish it because I just wanted to get to that finished product. And so I'm really driven by products and goals and visions that I want to bring into reality.
And I really think that's a great segue for, you have been over the past year or two, I don't remember the same exact timeline, so you can kind of hit on that. As you've been developing LVNGbook, what are some of the vision you have for it and the personal values that you've been aligning as you think about not only what gives you oxygen, but this company that you are now running and kind of bringing out into fruition?
Sure. I think a running theme through my life has been racial equity and equality. I grew up in a military family. My father was an officer. And so a lot of the spaces that we were in, we were a few, there were only a few other people of color. And I always kind of saw myself as bringing people together and helping people learn about each other. And I've always been passionate about creating equality. And so with LVNGbook, I realized that I've had the experience of going to the doctor and the doctor saying, "Hey, you need to change the way you eat," and they give me a list, and it's like, what do you do with the list? And I've had other friends who have gone to the doctor and have that same experience. And not only do they not know what to eat, but it often doesn't fit their culture. So 80% of dietitians in the US are white, but our country is increasingly diverse. So between African Americans, Latino Americans, Hispanic Americans, and all of the other influx of people that are in our country and the increasing diversity, that's not inappropriate to have that much Eurocentricity in the diet advice that we get from the healthcare system doesn't really reflect our population. And so I've been very passionate about creating a place where food and the way that we talk about diet and nutrition recognizes all of those different cultures. And it's not just about the ingredients or the specific dishes and recipes, but people bring different beliefs about food and different values about food and culture and have different connections. Yes. And it's really important to recognize that. And one of the things that I learned from Ideas xLab and spending my time with you all is the value that the United Nations places on culture when it comes to health.
Mhm.
And so I'm super excited about creating this vision where no matter who you are or what your background is or the food that you grew up with, when it's time to change, how we eat and really manage how we eat, that we can incorporate all of those dishes and ingredients and culture and values into that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you bring up the World Health Organization, and I think one of the quotes from one of the reports that we kind of shared and talked through together was that the systemic neglect of culture in health and healthcare is one of the greatest barriers to achieving our highest standard of health. And it also makes me think about, as you're talking about, the lens that dietitians are using, and how people value and celebrate food ways differently. I think about like the old ways African heritage diet. And you think about
Yeah.
that food pyramid, and the food pyramid that they have starts with not a food group, but communal, social time together around food. And so when you start to reconceptualize how all of these things intersect and are at play with each other, it's such a much more robust picture and requires such a different lens. You were talking about equity in terms of how we think about that.
Absolutely. And we really need all of that input into um, as we shape the way that we address health, and especially food and health, because everybody has different ways of looking at things. So, for example, there's a very practical example. Our United States dietary guidelines is very prescriptive, right? It says, you should eat at least 5 vegetables a day, you should have 2 pieces of fruit a day, and so forth. But when you look at dietary guidelines in other countries, for example, Brazil, they do not tell you how many pieces of fruit to eat or how many vegetables to eat. There's nothing prescriptive, there's no charts at all. It's all about cooking together and eating together and spending that time together. And that's how they view healthy eating. And I mean, it's a really beautiful view to read about and learn and go, And then when you think about, how can we incorporate that into our lives, and realizing how important it is to have that time together, to slow down, to really enjoy your food, to incorporate enjoying the company of others as you eat. It's just such a much more holistic approach. And it's an excellent example of how culture is an important part of health.
Well, and even, you mentioned the, prescriptive nature of you need to eat X, Y, and Z number of fruits and vegetables. Does, culturally it varies, but also everybody's individual body types and what different health thing considerations they may need to take into account. And so kind of as we move through our conversation, I'd love to pivot just a teeny bit to the concept of
Mhm.
covering, which we've talked a little bit about via email, which is from Deloitte's Uncovering Talent report. So thinking about the downplaying or hiding a facet of ourselves while we're at work, and you can think about it at work or in life. And there are also, instances of that related to food, in terms of what culturally you may be able to bring to work, etc. But for you as an individual, Shaun, I'd love to hear if there have been instances of covering within your life or within as you've launched LVNGbook, and how you've started to think about and put some structure around what does active uncovering look like, for your health and well-being.
Absolutely. So before I started LVNGbook, I was a health editor for Time Inc. I worked at Health Magazine for about 4 years, and then I worked in the cookbook publishing division for 4 years. And I've really loved both jobs. But one of the interesting dynamics was that I was often the only editor of color or one of few editors of color. And it's one thing when you're in a newsroom, and like a general newsroom, and you're reporting and you're having story idea meetings with your staff, and you might bring an angle that not everybody else is on board with, because they don't see that problem,
Mm-hmm.
and so they feel like, oh gee, it's not that important. When it comes to health journalism, it takes on a new dynamic. So for example, I once did a story about vitamin D. And the typical advice is you only need 10 or 15 minutes outside to get enough vitamin D. But that's only true if, well, I'll say it's not true if you have dark skin. So if you're African American or another culture with dark skin, then that you need more time in the sun. If you're weight, then the fat impacts the way that your body processes vitamin D. So you're going to need more time in the sun or more supplements. And depending on the clothing that you wear, if you're wearing a suit or if you always have your legs and arms covered, even if you have, so all of those factors about who we are on. I included a paragraph about if you have darker skin, you need more time in the sun. My editors came back and said, that's really not our audience, and we don't have a lot of space in the story. Yes, so we took it
Wow.
out. And I mean, think about the impact of that because now you're by omission creating a misinformation
Yeah.
for some people. And so it's really critical to be inclusive in health journalism. And then when I think about what I'm doing with Living Book, to be able to give people solutions for eating healthfully that align with their culture is going to help them stick with that prescriptive direction much easier. There are a lot of in the research that I did. I talked to over 100 people about how do they solve the problem of eating the way the doctor tells them
Mhm.
to without a lot of instruction. And a lot of people, especially women, said that they cook 2 meals a night. One for themselves if they were the person who was ill or if there was somebody else in the family, and then another meal for
For
everybody else
everyone else.
because right, nobody else wants to eat,
Yeah.
and then that's exacerbated if you incorporate culture. So I talked to a dietitian who'd done a study with Latina diabetics, and they would cook 2 meals a night. They would cook one meal that lined with the what the dietitian told them
Mhm.
that was very Eurocentric, but their family didn't want to eat that. So then she would cook the other meal that incorporated the traditional foods that she had grown up with, and that was the tradition that she was passing on.
Yeah.
You're less likely to stick to dietary change if your whole family is not doing it. And so that's really important. There actually is healthfulness in a traditional Mexican diet. It's been shown to help control insulin resistance. So there's this message that's subliminal that says you have to eat a Eurocentric diet because your diet's not healthy. And that's the wrong message to send. Um, and so there are so many ways that we can incorporate culture to help support that person making a lasting lifestyle change. So I think it's really, really important to get to your point of uncovering. I think it's really, really important to incorporate people from all walks of life into the solutions and conversations around health and healthcare because like we're increasingly becoming more sick, obesity is increasing, certain lifestyle diseases are increasing, and if we can incorporate all of these voices, I think we can move toward a solution much more effectively and faster. I know that was really long.
No, no, yeah, and I'm thinking of all of like the parallels within that example. You mentioned, how nutrition things and health stories, but it also gets down to the level of as we're thinking about health of how are prescription drugs tested and what population are who are they actually effective for and which one are they not, but they're being prescribed broadly, and that information doesn't always come out. So
Mhm.
I think that there's so many different facets to what you're speaking to that really makes so much sense and really have an impact. Um, I would love if you could delve a little bit more into what you are, how through Living Book you are combating that. If you have a few specific examples, and then we were talking about an upcoming, I believe, launch. So when will that be available, and what will that look like for people who are wanting to think about how they take a culturally responsive approach, whether it's because of diabetes or because of other health health conditions that they're trying to be cognizant of?
Sure. I'll start with the last part of your question. So Living Book will be available in mid to late May. And the way it will work is um, instead of getting this list from the doctor of what not to eat or what to eat and trying to figure out what to do with it, you can come to our platform. We're right now just doing our beta with cardiovascular disease, so high blood pressure, high cholesterol, those kinds of things. But you can come to our website and fill out a profile, and you can, for example, you could say, I have high blood pressure, I'm allergic to peanuts, I love Mexican food, and I'm on a kosher diet. You build your profile, and then Living Book gives you a personalized list of recipes that match your profile, and you get to choose the recipes that you like, and you get to create your own cookbook. And you get to choose a narrative. So you could choose, hey, I like to be in and out of the kitchen really quickly, or I indulge my wanderlust through food. There are a couple of other choices. You get to choose motivational quotes that really speak to you to be in your book. You get to personalize the title, so it could be Great Food Every Day with Josh. For example, we have a couple of other titles. And you get to choose a cover image. And the idea is not just to make it fun, but there's a lot of stigma around the existing advice and the way that it's packaged.
Yes.
Number one, if you're the patient, you kind of feel like, oh, I'm eating consolation prize food, or I can't eat the stuff that I love. And so you're less likely to stick with it. And then also, if you take home a cookbook that says cooking for diabetes, your family is not going to want to eat out of it probably. And so to take away that stigma is a powerful tool from a behavioral science standpoint. So after you build your cookbook, you immediately get a downloadable book that you can start cooking that night if you want to and start making that lifestyle change. And then 2 weeks later, you get a printed one-of-a-kind cookbook in the mail. So you actually have a physical product to show. I have a couple over here I'll just hold up. And the other thing is that it's not just a cookbook, but it's also a guide to habit change. So here's one of the options and that you can choose from.
Well,
And
that
so you
looks
can see,
delicious.
yeah, right. And you can see you can totally personalize it with your name. And it's a hardback book. Um, and so it's not just a cookbook, but it's also a guide to habit change. I worked with a behavioral scientist from Duke University, and we developed some tools and a chart, like a weekly planner to help you make the lifestyle change that you need to make. So we really want to help people make that lasting lifestyle change so they can support their health. So that's the second part of your question. The first part of your question, I think I've forgotten.
You hit on it pretty broadly. As you all are kind of expanding what the offerings are, what are some of the other focus areas that you'll be developing these different recipes around?
Sure, and I think you also asked how we incorporate culture.
Yes.
So yes, so one of the things that we've done is really taken a look at all of the people involved in creating the recipes and the whole visual experience of Living Book. So coming out of publishing, there's this idea of the average American or mainstream American, right? And that concept is 30 years old. And America's completely different now.
A little different. Evolved a bit.
It's pretty different now. So we're kind of we're really kind of focusing on the South for our initial launch and looking at what kinds of cuisines that people eat and who lives here in the South and what do they eat. So it's everything from things that we're familiar with, like Louisiana cooking or Low Country, Coastal Carolina cooking, or Tex-Mex, that kind of thing, all the way to the different cultures that are a part of the South. There are a lot of Greek Americans in Alabama. There are a lot of pockets around the South where there are Asian Americans from different countries. And so we're really looking at that. And then from there, finding recipe developers who understand home cooking, which is totally different from restaurant cooking, and also understand healthfulness, and how to develop a healthy recipe, and and are familiar with different cultures that we've identified, and having them develop recipes. So, for example, I'm working with a woman from India who lives in Alabama, and she has had like a vegetarian meal prep business for a while, and she also teaches cooking, and she's done some things for the American Heart Association. So she's helping us with some Indian recipes. And then beyond that, it also matters who is testing the recipe. So we have a separate person to test the recipe to make sure it works. And
Like
that
your own
person,
version of America's Test Kitchen.
totally, totally. Hold on just a moment. And that's really important, because we want people to be successful in the kitchen. So that person also but has to understand, like they've never seen the recipe before. That part's important. But it does help that they are familiar with the ingredients in the cuisine. I worked on a soul food book a little while ago, and there's like a recipe for chitlins, which is something that not everybody cooks. And so if you're testing that recipe and you don't know where they are or where to get them, or how, some basics about how to prepare them, then as far as cleaning and things like that, then you're not going to get a successful result. So there's some familiarity in the testing part, and then even shopping for ingredients, that's important.
Mhm.
And certainly on the other end, when we get to the consumer side, we'll definitely guide people there. But in the process of developing and testing, that familiarity is important. And then even visually, so we have a photograph for every recipe, and it really matters, who is doing that. Like, who is the prop stylist and what props are they bringing in? We don't want to fetishize things, but we also want to reflect the culture that and the traditions that the food comes from. And then, who's the food stylist? Like, again, they have to be familiar with the cuisine. It helps if they're familiar with how it's served,
Yeah.
so it's culturally appropriate. So all of those things factor into creating an experience that's really culturally appropriate and aware and reflects all of the traditions that, we're reaching out to.
Yeah, I remember one of our first conversations, you were describing, I didn't know that there were food stylists. So that was a whole new learning for me.
Uh-huh.
And it makes sense, but you were talking about, I think there was a shoot where one type of food was being made, and maybe the food stylist or the food procurer who went to actually purchase the food was not someone that had a deep familiarity with that cultural context. And so then you get, this kind of weird dynamic of how are we authentically portraying these dishes. And it was something I had never thought about until you brought that up, but it makes so much sense if we're really wanting all of these different messaging and these different ways of thinking about food and culture to come through and to honor the past that they build on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm really there isn't a lot of diversity among those kinds of culinary professionals, food stylists and prop
Mhm.
stylists and photographers. But I'm really teaching people how to food style, like the skills of food styling, so they can participate and even have their own careers, based off of that. But it's really exciting. So I'm really happy to kind of change the world of food media in that way.
Given how many different facets and people and networks and cultural understandings across different, because I'm sure there's variations as people live in different states and parts of the country. Are there some specific either instances or learnings or recipes that through this process you have kind of like has sparked like this, wow, I did not know about that, but now it's really informing how you're kind of working or moving forward or just how you relate to food?
Hmm, that's a good question. I've kind of been learning, um about the different. I've been taking time to learn about the different cuisines. I didn't. One of the most interesting things was, I believe it was University of Texas at Austin. There's a university in Texas that has digitized a collection of Mexican cookbooks that were published in 1950s or earlier, and then so and you can access it online. And going back and find that release kind of coincided with some new studies that came out about the traditional Mexican diet, and that is specifically referring to the Mexican diet before Americanization, so before the 60s, and how healthful it is. And so it's been really cool to have that piece of science and then to be able to actually go back and look at those cookbooks and see what's in them and the way food was prepared. And just to realize again how plant centric it was, how plant focused it is. And I mean, corn is a whole grain. I know that corn has been demonized because of corn syrup, but corn, it has more antioxidants than any other grain, you know. And so just to kind of have a fresh look at traditional Mexican cooking has really kind of, you know, and all the vegetables that are part of it. A lot of the sauces are vegetable based and nut
Mm.
based, and so it's a really healthful cuisine. And I think that as it's become Americanized, it's been associated with fried, you know, chips and deep fried, you know, burritos and things like
Mhm.
that, or tons of, you know, cheese, you know, and that's not really reflective of what it actually is. So that's been a really good learning, and just really kind of like a nice little renaissance for me to reconnect with Mexican food in that way.
Yeah, as you describe the different facets of what can be in the cookbook, I want to just make one that's a mixture of all of these things, because I think, you know, that's another great way of just exposing ourselves to better understanding so many different, outside of going to some restaurants or if you travel, a different way of understanding different cultures and how they are
Mhm.
prioritizing food and things. So I'm excited to see what some of those recipes are like and rope Theo into making some of them with me.
Absolutely. I think that would be a fun adventure.
So how, you know, right now with COVID-19, there's so much evolving. Has that impacted you all at all in terms of, one, kind of the rollout of Living Book, but also in terms of how you're thinking about structuring the recipes or the approach, or even as you think about how and what people will be able to access in terms of food?
Yes. So it did delay our release. So we've been building a responsive app that's the book building tool. And it did delay our development team a bit. So I'd say about it's been a 6 week delay. We're hoping to be able to finish the app this week, actually. And then we'll do a little.
Success.
I'm so excited. And then, you know, we'll do some focus group testing and then we'll release it. So it did delay us there. As far as our pivot, we've been doing a lot of social media for since November. And so when the outbreak happened of coronavirus, we quickly decided to do a new newsletter called Living at Home. And we decided to focus the newsletter on people who have to stay in because they have some type of chronic illness, which is our target audience, and giving them advice and tips for living at home,
Yeah.
how to work at home. One of the big issues is that a lot of pantry items, which everybody is stocking up on now, have extra salt and sugar in them.
A lot of
And
sodium.
so, for example, if you had like a recipe that had a can of tomatoes, like a regular can of tomatoes, and a regular can of beans, for some people that's already too much sodium. And so, how do you manage, you know, how do you cook so that way you're kind of managing the sodium level? So those are the kinds of things, you know, mental health things and those kinds of things we've been focusing on in that newsletter. So I think we're on week 7 of the newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter. So that's been really fun. And then going forward, that's a really good question about how we're developing a recipe. So we're just now about to start developing our new batch of recipes. And it usually takes 4 to 6 months to go through that process of developing and photographing recipes. So we have to think that far ahead. And it's really kind of uncertain now what people are going to be eating. You know, I think definitely people are going to be doing a lot more budget cooking, economy cooking.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably going to be doing more comfort food cooking, which is, reflects what happened during the last recession. But the thing that I'm still uncertain about is availability of food. So we know that a number of meat processors have shut down, and that's going to jeopardize supply. I've been reading that a lot of crops are being destroyed. I think that's just a matter of logistics. So I don't think that part of it will be long term, but I think that if crops are neglected because people are social distancing or isolating, then that could impact the food supply. So we're really trying to think about how can we focus on pantry items, ameliorate the things like salt and sugar, and develop recipes so that they're flexible. So, if you have some, for example, if you don't have regular flour, but you're able to find oat flour, how do you, can,
What's the adaptation look
yeah,
like?
yeah. I know some people that they couldn't find regular flour, but they found gluten-free flour, and they're not sure about how to. They're not, they don't need gluten-free items, and they've never
Mm-hmm.
cooked with gluten-free flour before. So, like, is it the same? Do I have to do anything different? So, so some of those challenges are things that we're trying to develop for right now.
That makes so much sense to me, even as I think about our grocery purchasing habits. Like that has evolved because it's like what will stay good in the fridge, what like all of this new way of thinking. We can only go X number of times because it's so much more difficult, and so our purchasing has evolved, and I'm not sure how and if like what the future of that looks like. So it's great to hear that you all are thinking about that.
Yeah.
The editorial background in me is super interested in. You talk about a 4 to 6 month process for like developing the recipes and the photography. How like what is the when you think about a new set of them, what is the scale of that? Like how many recipes and how many kind of hands are in the kitchen in the creation of that?
So we'll do 30 to 60 recipes in the fall, and then 120 to 150 recipes for the new year. Um, yeah, so that's I usually assign no more than 12 recipes to any one recipe developer, and we use Airtable actually to kind of coordinate to make sure
Okay.
nobody's overlapping, their ideas and concepts. And so each developer, so it's going to be probably about 8 developers that I'll have working on recipes.
Mm-hmm.
And then that as many testers, probably fewer testers because you don't have to have the same kind of separation that you do, but several testers. One of the other things that we've thought about doing is doing 2 rounds of testing where there's a professional recipe tester who does all the measurements, like, okay, it was exactly 3.5 minutes on this, sauteing this, or for sodium from, yeah, it's like really complicated. So
It's a
you
lot of
need a
math
professional
going
tester
on.
that way. But then it really helps. I think we're frozen. Oh, there we are. Okay. So aside from the professional testing, it really helps to have just an amateur tester. So I might put in a round of that, which is something we haven't done before. But I think it's really helpful just to know that a regular everyday person with basic skills can get through the recipe and get a successful result and not spend like hours in the kitchen making it. So, so we'll probably do that. And then from there, we have a nutritionist do the nutritional analysis, and then from there, the recipe testers usually take pictures of what they made, so that way it informs the photography team, so they can see what ingredients are in it, what colors are in
Mm-hmm.
it, what props might look good with it, and then that team, the photography team, is usually 6 people. So Yeah, so it's
That's a lot.
usually it's a lot. It is. It is. But it's a really fun experience to finally get it, into photography, and to work on set and to see sometimes recipes like when they're cooked at home, they taste good, but they don't look pretty. And I've had some things in my career where I look at the food style and was like, good luck with that.
Have fun.
Yeah. And they managed to make it beautiful. So, it really does help for them to have the testing photo. And then they look at the testing photo and then they pick their props and decide how they're going to approach styling it. So it's very fun. And then there's some editors along the way to make sure that the recipe is written in a way that it's really easy to get through. Just some basics like all the ingredients in the list have to be in the same order that you use them in the method, and making sure things are referred to, which is going to be really important for us because we're doing recipes from different cultures to make sure what we call the ingredient is something that everybody recognizes or that can find, you
Mhm.
know. So, but yeah, so it's a really fun process. It seems long, but when you're doing it, it goes by fast.
Well, thank you for indulging that interest.
Sure.
I think the whole process is really fascinating, and I agree. There are some things that either I've made, or even when you go to a restaurant sometimes, and it's just like it's so delicious, but it can be very challenging to make it look good.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. But as we wrap up our time together today, I want to switch, kind of step away from Living Book for a second, and just thinking about the past 7 weeks for you during COVID-19 and being in Atlanta. Is there an artistic outlet, a hobby? What is it that you are kind of finding to fill you back up that is outside of work or or just kind of something you're finding some moments of gratitude in?
Sure. So I have three pets now. I just adopted my mother's dog. I'm usually still, pretty intensely working on getting Living Book out. So they really kind of help me stay grounded and remind me to, stop and smell the roses. The other thing is that I've really, like a lot of people, I've really kind of gotten into cooking and really enjoying it again. I think for the past 2 years that I've been working on the startup, I've just been eating just to survive, just so
Yeah.
I can keep working. And now I'm getting more into cooking, for my family and really enjoying cooking and, planning meals. And I subscribe to a box called Misfits.
Yes,
Um,
I haven't heard of that one.
yeah, it's called Misfits Market, and it's all of the produce that isn't pretty enough to be in the grocery store. This company takes it and packages it and sends it to you as a subscription box. And so it's about 25 bucks for each box, and you can determine whether you want it once a week or twice a month or however frequently you want. And sometimes you get to choose or name some preferences,
Yeah.
but it's really just kind of like a random box of vegetables, and you get a good amount of food for the price. So that's been really fun just to kind of figure out what's in the box this week, and oh, what are we going to do with this? So that's been really kind of fun. And other than that, I'm in a couple of groups here in Atlanta that obviously we can't meet physically
Mhm.
anymore, but people have found really fun ways to stay connected online. So that's been really cool too.
Yeah, it's great. You know, Based on where we are in life, our relationship to food and to cooking evolves, like you were talking about. So
Hmm.
it's nice that you've been able to rekindle that. I know for a few years when I was working for a publication and doing a lot of photography, that kind of exhausted the part of photography that filled me up and brought out that passion. And so after I was able to step away from that and combine it with my running, it kind of
Hmm.
reinvigorated it a little bit. So
Hmm.
I'm glad that you've had the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, it's felt good. It really has to reconnect. So very cool.
Well, we are right at the end of our time, so I Thank you so much for joining me today, Shaun. Before we sign off, if people are interested in signing up for the newsletter that you all are doing or learning more about Living Book, where would you recommend that they find you?
Please go to our website. It's lvngbook.com, no I's. So lvngbook.com. And right now there is a get early access button. And if you click that, you'll be added to our email list and you can start receiving the Living at Home newsletter. And then we'll also let you know when Living Book is available for purchase and you can put together your own cookbook.
Awesome. Well, I am so glad we got to touch base today, as it is always good to connect with you and hear your voice. And I am excited to make my own recipe book when it's ready. So have a great week, Shaun.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good week.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye, Shaun. All right, everyone, thank you for tuning in for today's Uncovering Video podcast, powered by Switcher Studio and supported by Manning Clay. I am really thankful to have had these conversations over the past few weeks, including today's with Shaun Chavis of Living Book. If you'd like to tune in for our next one, it is Tuesday at noon Eastern Standard Time on Ideas xLab's Facebook page. I'll be talking to Tanya Ablin of Churchill Downs. Next week would have been our Run to the Roses week as we head to the Kentucky Derby, which has now been moved to September. So we're going to be talking about the Derby tradition and a lot of different facets of that. We've gotten to experience that together over the past few years, and they've got some fun ways to continue engaging in that tradition moving forward. So learn more about the series, ideasxlab.com/uncovering, and we'll see you next time.